What happens every single time I come is that I run the full gamut emotionally. I mean, half the time I'm laughing uproariously, and the other I'm in tears half the time too with some of these profound stories. So it's just there's always surprising stuff. There's always new stuff. It's just always great.
I can't really conduct my defense from any place except Canada, and as a result, I feel I now know Canada much better than I ever knew it before. And I have returned to this country, which I always said I would do, incidentally. I have returned to it at an absolutely fascinating time in the history of this country. I mean, all of you who were, as I was, brought up in Canada know that we were brought up to believe Canada was, in Mr. Diefenbaker's phrase, a middle power. And that really even those who found it a grating practice were more or less resigned to the fact that much of our role in the world was tugging at the trouser leg of the United States. No doubt in creditable causes, but that's essentially what we were doing. And the correlation of forces between Canada and the United States and Canada's position in the world have evolved very favorably for this country with startling swiftness. At $70 a barrel, we have greater oil reserves than any country in the world, commercially viable oil reserves. Water. I mean, most of my life, water was, at least in this country, pretty much taken for granted. And without tampering with the water tables in the Great Lakes or anything that's environmentally harmful, trillions of gallons could be captured every day from the ocean, from the great rivers flowing into the Pacific and the Arctic and the Atlantic, and reused in places where it's needed. It used to be, as you all know, for the first 200 years of the Industrial Revolution, that hewers of wood and drawers of water was a dismissive, disparaging comment on primitive economies, and that those economies were sophisticated and respected, which were based on heavy industry and manufacturing. Well, now manufacturing is outsourced, except for the most sophisticated levels of it. People have better and more remunerative things to do, but you can't outsource resources. And when the hewers of wood and drawers of water are, in fact, sitting on the treasure chest of this country with absolutely every resource of energy, base metals, precious metals, forest products, and agriculture, except for a few exotic tropical fruits, or probably not too many pineapples or something. But apart from that, everything else, it is indeed an astoundingly rich country inhabited by a very well-educated population. And there's a huge opportunity for Canada. There are now 191 member states in the United Nations, and Canada is without a question one of the 10 most important ones. And I don't think Canadians have quite adjusted to the sudden uptick in our status in the world. And probably foreigners haven't either, so we may have to remind them of it in our gentle and modest Canadian way. But it is real, and it is something that is a huge opportunity for this country, and it is a terribly exciting time to have returned to Canada. And I would say another element of that is that one of the greatest political cause in this country in my time, and I was very involved in it at times, was the issue of the potential independence of Quebec. And of course there was a serious threat of the secession of Quebec, and one of the reasons that in general, despite my differences with him in a lot of things, I supported Pierre Trudeau was that I thought he was the indispensable man in dealing with the Quebec separatists. And there was an acceptance in the rest of Canada that if 50.1% of Quebecers voted yes in a vaguely formulated independence referendum question, they actually had the right to leave the country, and there wasn't much we could do about it. And it created almost a collapsed lung in this country that afflicted the country and its credibility geopolitically for decades. Well, that really has stopped. I don't think a comparable group to the French Canadians has been more openly and generously, and by which I do not mean condescendingly or patronizingly, I mean fairly and generously and conscientiously approached and treated. I don't think there is a better example than the Canadian example of the last 30 years or 40 years. I'm not suggesting French Canada had no grievances prior to that. And that problem has abated. And parts of the rest of the country, especially Alberta, have become astoundingly rich. Quebec is demographically less important than it was, and despite my well-publicized differences with Jean Chrétien, I think we must give him credit for the Clarity Act. I myself thought it should have gone farther, but now that it is inescapable that a secessionist vote has to be a strong majority on a clear question, independence has died. So that problem is removed. So we have a relatively united country with the restoration of a system where either of the major parties can win an election, instead of a 1.5-party system that we had where the Liberals governed for 80 years out of the last 110 years. Now, most of the time it wasn't bad government, but in general you would want, as in Britain or the United States, the possibility of either side winning coming up to each election. And these are changes in this country, and I wrote a piece for the National Post that will be there tomorrow, in which I conclude by saying Sir Wilfrid Laurier was right when he spoke of Canada's century. He was just a century early. I think my time has expired, and if there was an organizing principle in this rumination that I've inflicted on you, it would be that all challenges, no matter how difficult and unpleasant, as long as they don't threaten your life itself, do have consolations. And I'm very, very pleased to say that one of the consolations in this case is my reacquaintance with this country. And I've found it absolutely agreeable, and I'm looking forward to building on it. Anyway, thank you all for hearing me.